absolutely open to the street, sir. And that same Swiss fellow had just told me before that the town was full of spies and what they call sbirri that came from Turin with the king. The king is staying at the palace, sir. They are expecting the Queen of Sardinia to arrive any day. You didn't know, sir? They say she will come in an English man of war. That old cobbler was very abusive about the King of Piedmont, too. Surely talk like that can't be safe anywhere. Spire paused suddenly, and Cosmo Latham turned his back to the fire. Well, and what happened? He asked with a smile. You could have heard a pin drop, said Spire in equable tones, till that Signor Contalucci, that's the padrone of this inn, sir. The man who lighted me up, said Cosmo. Yes, sir. I didn't know he was in the room till suddenly he spoke behind my back, telling one of the scullions that was there to give the man a glass of wine. And what the old fellow must do but raise it above his head and shout a toast to the destructor of the Austrians before he tossed it down his throat. I was quite astonished, but Signor Contalucci never turned a hair. He offered his snuff-box to that doctor's courier and myself and shrugged his shoulders. It was only Pietro, he said, a little mad. He tapped his forehead, you know, sir. The doctor's courier sat there grinning. I got suddenly uneasy about you, sir, and went out to the front door to see whether you were coming. It's very different from what it was 30 years ago. There was no talk in Italy of cutting foreigners' throats when Sir Charles and I were here. It was quite a startling experience. Cosmo nodded. You seem impressed, Spire. Well, I, too, had an experience just as the sun was setting. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. What do you mean? Why should you be sorry? I beg pardon, sir. I thought it was something unpleasant. Cosmo had a little laugh. Unpleasant? No, not exactly. Though I think it was more dangerous than yours. And if there was any madness connected with it, it had a very visible method. It was not all talk, either. Yes, Spire, it was exciting. I don't know what's come to them all. Everybody seems excited. There was not excitement in Italy 30 years ago when I was with Sir Charles and took 4 horses with only 1 helper from this very town to Florence, sir. Cosmo, with fixed eyes, did not seem to hear Spire's complaining remark. He exclaimed, Really, it was very extraordinary, so suddenly that Spire gave a perceptible start. He pulled himself together and asked in a purely business tone, Are you going to dine in your room, sir? Time is getting on. Cosmo's mood, too, seemed to have changed completely. I don't know. I'm not hungry. I want you to move one of those screens here near the fire and place a table and chair there. I will do some correspondence tonight. Yes, I will have my dinner here, I think. I will go down and order it, sir, said Spire. The cook here is a Frenchman who married a native, and... Who on earth is swearing like this outside? Exclaimed Cosmo, while Spire's face also expressed astonishment at the loud burst of voices coming along the corridor. One angry, the other argumentative, in a crescendo of scolding and expostulation, which, passing the door at its highest, died away into a confused murmur in the distance of the long corridor. That was an English voice, said Cosmo. I mean the angry one. I should think it's that English doctor from Tuscany that has been 3 or 4 days here already. He has been put on this floor. From what I have been able to catch, said Cosmo, he seems very angry at having a neighbor on it. That must be me. Have you heard his name? It's Marvel or some such name. He seems to be known here. He orders people about as if he were at home. The other was Contalucci, sir. Very likely. Look here, Spire. I will dine in the public room downstairs. I want to see that angry gentleman. Did you see him, Spire? Only his back, sir. Very broad, sir. Tall man, in boots and a riding coat. Are you going down now, sir? The dinner must be on already. Yes, said Cosmo, preparing to go out. And by the by, Spire, if you ever see in the street or in that room downstairs, where everyone comes in and out, as you say, a long fellow wearing a peculiar cap with a tassel, just try to find out something about him. Or at any rate, let me know when you have seen him. You could perhaps follow him for a bit and try to see where he goes. After saying those words, Cosmo left the room before Spire could make any answer. Spire's astonishment expressed itself by a low exclamation. Well, I never. Part 2. Chapter 1. Cosmo descended into a hall, now empty, and with most of its lights extinguished. A loud murmur of voices guided him to the door of the dining room. He discovered it to be a long apartment with flat pilasters dividing its whitewashed walls, and resembling somewhat a convent's refectory. The resemblance was accentuated by the two narrow tables occupying its middle. One of them had been appropriated by the British naval officers, had lights on it, and bristled with the necks of wine bottles along its whole length. The talk round it was confused and noisy. The other, shorter table accommodated 2 rows of people in somber garments, who at first glance struck Cosmo as natives of the town and belonging to a lower station in life. They had less lights, less wine, and almost no animation. Several smaller tables were ranged against the walls at equal intervals, and Cosmo's eye was caught by one of them because of the candles in the sconce on the wall above it having been lighted. Its cloth was dazzlingly white, and Signor Cantalucci, with a napkin in his hand, stood respectfully at the elbow of its sole occupant, who was seated with his back to the door. Cosmo was under the impression that his entrance had been unobserved, but before he had walked half the length of the room, Signor Cantalucci, whose eyes had never ceased darting here and there while his body preserved its deferential attitude at the elbow of the exclusive client, advanced to meet him with his serious and attentive air. He bowed. Perhaps the signore would not mind sharing the table of his illustrious countryman. Yes, if my countryman doesn't object, assented Cosmo readily. He was absolutely certain that this must be the doctor of whom Spire had spoken. Cantalucci had no doubt that His Excellency's company would be most welcome to his illustrious countryman. Then, stepping aside, he added under his breath, "He is a person of great distinction, a most valued patron of mine." The person thus commended, turning his head ensconced in the high collar of his coat, disclosed to Cosmo a round face with a shaved chin, strongly marked eyebrows, round eyes, and thin lips compressed into a slightly peevish droop, which, however, was at once corrected by an attempt at a faint smile. Cosmo, too, produced a faint smile. For an appreciable moment they looked at each other without saying a word, while Cantalucci, silent too, executed a profound bow. "Sit down, sir. Sit down," said the elder man. Cosmo judged him to be well over 40. Raising his voice above the uproar made by the occupants of the naval table, and waving his hand at the empty chair facing his own, it had a high carved back, showing some traces of gilding, and the silk which covered it was worn to rags. Cosmo sat down while Cantalucci disappeared, and the man across the table positively shouted, "I am glad," and immediately followed that declaration by an energetic, "Oh, damn!" He bent over the table. "One can't hear oneself speak with that noisy lot. All heroes, no doubt, but not a single gentleman." He leaned back and waited till the outburst of noisy mirth had died out at the officers' table. The The corners of his mouth drooped again, and Cosmo came to the conclusion that that face in repose was decidedly peevish. "I don't know what they have got to be so merry about," the other began, with a slight glance at the naval table and leaning forward again towards Cosmo. "Their occupation is gone. Heroes are a thoughtless lot. Yet just look at that elderly lieutenant at the head of the table. Shabby coat, old epaulette. He doesn't laugh. He will die a lieutenant on half pay. That's how heroic people end when the heroic times are over." "I am glad," said Cosmo steadily, "that you recognize at least their heroism." The other opened his mouth for some time before he laughed, and that gave his face an expression of somewhat hard jollity. But the laugh, when it came, was by no means loud, and had a sort of ingratiating softness. "No, no, don't think I am disparaging our sea service. I had the privilege to know the greatest hero of them all. Yes, I had 2 talks with Lord Nelson. Well, he was certainly not—" He interrupted himself, and raising his eyes, saw the perfectly still gaze of Cosmo fastened on his face. Then peevishly, "What I meant to say was that he at least was indubitably a hero. I remember that I was very careful about what I said to him. I had to be mighty careful then about what I said to anybody. Someone might have put it into his head to hang me at some yardarm or other." "I envy you your experience all the same," said Cosmo amiably. "I suppose your conscience was clear?" "I have always been most careful not to give my conscience any license to trouble me," retorted the other, with a certain curtness of tone which was not offensive. "And I have lived now for some considerable time. I am really much older than I look," he concluded, giving Cosmo such a keen glance that the young man could not help a smile. The other went on looking at him steadily for a while, then let his eyes wander to a door in a distant part of the long room, as if impatient for the coming of the dinner. Then giving it up, "A man who has lived actively, I say, the last 20 years may well feel as old as Methuselah. Lord Nelson was but a circumstance in my life. I wonder, had he lived, how he would have taken all this." A slight movement of his hand seemed to carry this allusion outside the confines of the vaulted, noisy room, to indicate all the out-of-doors of the world. Cosmo remarked that the hand was muscular, shapely, and extremely well cared for. "I think there can be no doubt about the nature of his feelings if he were living." Cosmo's voice was exactly non-committal. His interlocutor grunted slightly. He would have done nothing but groan and complain about anything and everything. No, he wouldn't have taken it laughing. Very poor physique, very. Frightful hypochondriac. I am a doctor, you know." Cantalucci was going to attend himself on his 2 guests. He presented to the doctor a smoking soup tureen enveloped in a napkin. The doctor assumed at once a businesslike air, and at his invitation Cosmo held out his plate. The doctor helped him carefully. "Don't forget the wine, my wine, Anselmo," he said to Cantalucci, who answered by a profound bow. "I saved his life once," he continued after the innkeeper had gone away. The tone was particularly significant. Cosmo, partly repelled and partly amused by the man, inquired whether the worthy host had been very ill. The doctor swallowed the last spoonful of soup. "Ill?" he said. "He had a gash that long in his side, and a set of 40-pound fetters in his legs. I cured both complaints, not without some risk to myself, as you may imagine. There was an epidemic of hanging and shooting in the south of Italy then." He noticed Cosmo's steady stare, and raised the corners of his mouth with an effect of geniality on his broad, rosy face. "In '99, you know. I wonder I didn't die of it, too. I was considerably younger then, and my humane instincts, early enthusiasms, and so on, had led me into pretty bad company. However, I had also pretty good friends. What with one thing and another, I am pretty well known all over Italy. My name is Martel, Dr. Martel. You probably may have heard." He threw a searching glance at Cosmo, who bowed noncommittally and went on without a pause. "I am the man who brought vaccine to Italy first. Contalucci was trying to tell me your name, but really I couldn't make it out." "Latham is my name," said Cosmo, "and I only set foot in Italy for the first time in my life 2 days ago." The doctor jerked his head sideways. "Latham, eh? Yorkshire?" "Yes," said Cosmo, smiling. "To be sure. Sir Charles. That's my father." "Yes, yes. Served in the Guards. I used to know the doctor of his regiment. Married in Italy. I don't remember the lady's name. Oh, those are old times. Might have been 100 years ago." "You mean that so much history has been made since?" "Yes, no end of history," assented the doctor, but checked himself. "And yet tell me, what does it all amount to?" Cosmo made no answer. Contalucci having brought the wine while they talked, the doctor filled 2 glasses, waited a moment as if to hear Cosmo speak, but as the young man remained silent, he said, "Well, let us drink, then, to peace." He tossed the wine down his throat, while Cosmo drank his much more leisurely. As they set down their empty glasses, they were startled by a roar of a tremendous voice filling the vaulted room from end to end, in order to "let their honors know that the boat was at the steps." The doctor made a faint grimace. "Do you hear the voice of the British Lion, Mr. Latham?" he asked peevishly. "Ah, well, we will have some little peace now here." Those officers at the naval table who had to go on board rose in a body and left the room hastily. 3 or 4 who had a longer leave drew close together and began to talk low with their heads in a bunch. Cosmo, glancing down the room, seemed to recognize at the door the form of the seaman whom he had met earlier in the evening. He followed the officers out. The other diners, the somber ones, and a good many of them with powdered heads, were also leaving the room. Contalucci put another dish on the table, stepped back a pace with a bow, and stood still. A moment of profound silence succeeded the noise. "First rate," said Dr. Martel to Cosmo after tasting the dish, and then gave a nod to Contalucci, who made another bow and retreated backwards, always with a solemn expression on his face. "Italian cooking, of course, but then I'm an old Italian myself. Not that I love them, but I have acquired many of their tastes. Before we have done dining, you will have tasted the perfection of their cookery, north and south. But I assure you, you are sharing my dinner. You don't suppose that the dishes that come to this table are the same the common customers get?" Cosmo made a slight bow. "I am very sensible of the privilege," he said. "The honor and the pleasure are mine, I assure you," the doctor said in a half-careless tone, and looking with distaste towards the small knot of officers with a 24 hours' leave, who had finished their confabulation and had risen in a body like men who had agreed on some pleasant course of action. Only the elderly lieutenant, lagging a little behind, cast a glance at his 2 countrymen at the little table, and followed his comrades with less eager movements. A quarter of a tough bullock and half a roast sheep are more in their way, and Cantalucci knows it. As to that company that was sitting at the other table, well, I dare say you can tell yourself what they were. Small officials or tradesmen of some sort. I should think that emptying all their pockets, and they were how many? Say 20? You couldn't collect the value of 1 English pound at any given time. And Cantalucci knows that, too. Well, of course. Still, he does well here, but it's a poor place. I wonder, Mr. Latham, what are you doing here? Well, said Cosmo with a good-humored smile, I am just staying here, just as you yourself are staying here. Ah, but you never saved Cantalucci's life, whereas I did, and that's the reason why I am staying here. Out of mere kindness, and to give him an opportunity to show his gratitude. Let me fill your glass. Not bad, this wine. Excellent. What is it? God knows. Let us call it Cantalucci's gratitude. Generous stuff, this, to wash down those dishes with. Gluttony is an odious vice, but an ambition to dine well is about the only one which can be indulged at no cost to one's fellow men. It didn't strike me, murmured Cosmo absently, for he was just then asking himself why he didn't like this pleasant companion, and had just come to the conclusion that it was because of his indecisive expression, wavering between peevishness and jocularity, with something else in addition, as it were, in the background of his handsome, neat, and comfortable person. Something that was not aggressive, nor yet exactly impudent. He wondered at his mistrust of the personality, which certainly was very communicative, but apparently not inquisitive. At that moment he heard himself addressed with a direct inquiry. You passed, of course, through Paris? Yes, and Switzerland. Oh, Paris. I wonder what it looks like now. Full of English people, of course. Let's see. How many years is it since I was last there? Ha! Lots of heads rolled off very noble shoulders since. Well, I am trying to make my way there. Curious times. I have found some letters here. Duke of Wellington very much disliked, what? His nod is insupportable, eh? I have just had a sight of the Duke 2 or 3 times, said Cosmo. I can assure you that everybody is treating him with the greatest respect. Of course, of course. All the same, I bet that all these foreigners are chuckling to themselves at having finished the job without him. They needn't be so pleased with themselves, said Cosmo scornfully. The mere weight of their numbers. Yes, it was more like a migration of armed tribes than an army. They will boast of their success all the same. There is no saying what the Duke himself thinks. I wonder if he could have beaten the other in a fair fight. Well, that will never be known now. Cosmo had a sudden sense of an epical tale with a doubtful conclusion. He made no answer. Cantalucci had come and gone solemnly, self-contained, with the usual 2 ceremonial bows. As he retreated, he put out all the candles on the central table and became lost to view. From the illuminated spot at which he sat, Cosmo's eyes met only the shadows of the long refectory-like room with its lofty windows closely shuttered, so that they looked like a row of niches for statues. Yet the murmur of the piazza, full of people, stole faintly into his ear. Cosmo had the recollection of the vast expanse of flagstones enclosed by the shadowy and palatial masses, gleaming with lights here and there under the night sky, thick with stars, and perfectly cloudless. This is a very quiet inn, he observed. It has that advantage, certainly. The walls are very thick, as you can see. It's an unfinished palace, I mean as to its internal decorations, which were going to be very splendid and even more costly than splendid. The owner of it, I mean the man who had it built, died of hunger in that hall out there." "Died of hunger?" repeated Cosmo. "No doubt about it. It was during the siege of Genoa. You know the siege, surely?" Cosmo recollected himself. "I was quite a child at the time," he said. The venerated client of Cantalucci cracked a walnut and then looked at Cosmo's face. "I should think you weren't 7 years old at the time," he said in a judicial tone. "When I first came into Italy with the vaccine, you know, Sir Charles's marriage was still being talked about in Florence. I remember it perfectly, though it seems as if it had all happened in another world. Yes, indubitably he died of hunger, like 10,000 other Genoese. He couldn't go out to hunt for garbage with the populace, or crawl out at night trying to gather nettles in the ditches outside the forts. And nobody would have known that he was dead for a month if one of the bombs out of a bomb vessel with Admiral Keith's blockading squadron hadn't burst the door in. They found him at the foot of the stairs, and, they say, with a lot of gold pieces in his pockets. But nobody cared much for that. If it had been a lot of half-gnawed bones, there would have been blood spilt, no doubt. For all I know, there were, or maybe even now, secret places full of gold in the thickness of these walls. However, the body was thrown into a corpse cart, and the authorities boarded the doorway. It remained boarded for years because the heirs didn't care to have anything to do with that shell of a palace. I fancy that the last of them died in the snows of Russia. Cantalucci came along, and, owing to a friendship with some sort of scribe in the municipality, he got permission to use the place for his hostelry. He told me that he found several half-ducats in the corners of the hall when he took possession. I suppose they paid for the whitewash, for I can't believe that Cantalucci had much money in his pockets. Perhaps he found one of those secret hiding places of which you spoke, suggested Cosmo. What, Cantalucci? He never looked for any gold. He is too much in the clouds. But he has made us dine well in the palace of the starved man, hasn't he? 16 years ago in Naples he was a Jacobin, and a friend of the French, a rebel, a traitor to his king, if you like. But he has a good memory. There is no denying that. Is he a Neapolitan, then? Asked Cosmo. I imagined they were of a different type. God only knows. He was there, and I didn't ask him. He was a prisoner of the royalists, of the reactionaries. I was much younger then, and perhaps more humane. Flesh and blood couldn't stand in the sight of the way in which they were being treated. Men of position, of attainments, of intelligence. The Neapolitan Jacobins were no populace. They were men of character and ideas, the pick of all classes. They were properly liberals. Still, they were called Jacobins, and you may be surprised that I, a professional man and an Englishman— Cosmo, looking up at the sudden pause, saw the doctor sitting with the dull eyes and the expression of a man suddenly dissatisfied with himself. Cosmo hastened to say that he himself was no friend of reactionaries, and in any case not conceited enough to judge the conduct of men older than himself. Without a sign that he had heard a word of that speech, the doctor had a faint and peevish smile. He never moved at all till, after a longish interval, Cosmo spoke again. "Were you expecting somebody that would want to see you this evening?" he asked. The doctor started. "See me? No. Why do you ask?" "Because within the last 5 minutes somebody has put in his head twice through the door. And as I don't expect either a visitor or a messenger, I thought he was looking for you. I don't know a single soul here." The doctor remained perfectly unmoved. Cosmo, who was looking towards the distant door, saw the head again, and this time shouted at it an inquiry. Thereupon the owner of the head entered, and had not advanced half the length of the room before Cosmo recognized in him the portly figure of Spire. To his great surprise, however, Spire, instead of coming up to the table, made a vague gesture and stopped short. This was strange conduct. The doctor sat completely unconscious, and Cosmo took the course of excusing himself and following Spire, who, directly he had seen his master rise, had retreated rapidly to the door. The doctor did not rouse himself to answer, and Cosmo left him leaning on his elbow in a thoughtful attitude. In the badly lighted hall he found Spire waiting for him, between the foot of the stairs and the door, which Cosmo presumed was leading to the offices of the hotel. Again Spire made a vague gesture which seemed to convey a warning, and approached his master on tiptoe. "Well, what is it? What do you mean by flourishing your arm at me like this?" asked Cosmo sharply, and Spire ventured on a warning, "Shh." "Why, there is nobody here," said Cosmo, lowering his voice nevertheless. "I wanted to tell you, sir, I have seen that fellow." "What fellow?" "Oh, yes, the fellow with the cap. Where did you see him?" "He is here," said Spire, pointing to the closed door. "Here? What could a man like that want here? Did you speak to him?" "No, sir. He has just come in, and for all I know he may be already gone away, though I don't think so." "Oh, you don't think so? Do you know what he has come for?" Spire made no answer to the question, but after a short silence, "I will go and see. And if you stand where you are, sir, you will be able to look right into the room. He may not be the man." Without waiting for an answer, he moved towards the closed door and threw it wide open. The room, very much like the dining room, but smaller, was lighted gloomily by two smoky oil lamps hanging from the ceiling over a trestle table having a wooden bench on each side. Bad as the light was, Cosmo made out at once the peculiar cap. The wearer, sitting on one of the benches, was leaning with both elbows across the table towards the fair head of a girl, half hidden by a lace scarf. They were engaged in earnest conversation, so that they never turned their heads at Spire's entrance. Cosmo had just time to discern the fine line of the girl's shoulders, which were half turned from him, when Spire shut the door. Chapter 2. Returning to his bedroom, Cosmo found the fire of logs still playing fitfully upon the drawn curtains, upon the dim shape of the canopied bed of state, and perceived that Spire, as directed, had prepared the writing-table, and had placed a screen round the inviting-looking armchair. He did not sit down to write. He felt more than ever that in a moment of amused expansion he had made a rash promise to his sister. The difficulty in keeping it had confronted him for the first time in Paris. Henrietta would have liked to hear of people he met, of the great world indulging in the new-found freedom of travel, the English, the French, the Poles, the Germans. Certainly he had seen quite a lot of people, but the problem was as to what could be said about them to a young girl, ignorant of the world, brought up in the country, and having really no notion of what mankind was like. He admitted to himself with introspective sincerity that even he did not exactly know what mankind was really like. He was too much of a novice, and she, obviously, was too innocent to be told of his suspicions and of what it was like. Even to describe the world outwardly was not an easy task to Henrietta. The world was certainly amusing, Oh, yes, it was amusing, but even as he thought that, he felt within him a certain distaste. Just before he had left Paris, he had been at a rout given by a great lady. There was a fellow there who somehow became suspected of picking pockets. He was extremely ugly and therefore attracted notice. The great lady asked if she had invited him, denied ever having seen him before, but he assured her that he had spoken to her already that evening. Her ladyship then declared that if he was really the man he gave himself out to be, she was not aware that he was in Paris. She imagined him to be in Ireland. Altogether a peculiar story. Cosmo never knew how it had ended, because his friend Hollis led him away to introduce him to Mrs. R., who was most affable and entertained him with a complete inventory of her daughter's accomplishments, the daughter herself being then in the room, obviously quite lovely and clever, but certainly a little odd. For a little later, on his being introduced, she had discoursed to him for half an hour on things of the heart, charmingly, but in a perfectly cool and detached manner. There was also Lady Jane, very much in evidence, very much run after, with a voice of engaging sweetness, but very free, not to say licentious, in her talk. How could he confide his impressions of her to Henrietta? As a matter of fact, his head had been rather full of Lady Jane for some time. She had, so to speak, attended him all the way from Paris up to the morning of his arrival at Cantalucci's inn. But she had now deserted him. Or was it his mind that had dropped her out of a haunting actuality into that region where the jumble of one's experiences is allowed to rest? But was it possible that a shabby fellow in tight breeches and bad boots, with a peculiarly shaped cap on his head, could have got between him and Lady Jane about the time of sunset? Cosmo thought suddenly that one's personal life was a very bizarre thing. He could write to his sister that before he had been 3 hours in Genoa, he had been involved in passing secret correspondence from Italy to the island of Elba. Henrietta had solemnly charged him to write everything he could find out, hear, or even guess about Napoleon. He had heard, certainly, of most extraordinary stories, and if he had not made any guesses, he had been associating with persons who actually had been doing nothing else. Frightened persons, exulting people, cast-down people, frivolous people, people with airs of mystery or with airs of contempt. But by Jove, now he had been in personal touch and had actually helped a man of the people who was mysteriously corresponding with Elba. He could write something about that, but, after all, was it worth while? Finally, he concluded he wouldn't write home at all that evening, pushed the table away, and, throwing himself into the armchair, extended his legs towards the fire. A moody expression settled on his face. His immobility resembled open-eyed sleep, with the red spark of the fire in his unwinking eyes, and a perfect insensibility to outward impressions. But he heard distinctly Spire knocking discreetly at the door. Cosmo's first impulse was to shout that he wasn't wanted, but he changed his mind. "Come in." Spire shut the door carefully, and crossing the room at once, put a log on the fire. Then he said, "Can't get any hot water this evening, sir. Very sorry, sir. I will see that it won't happen again." At the same time he thought, served him right for picking out such an inn to stay at. Cosmo, still silent, stared at the fire, and when he roused himself at last, he perceived Spire in the act of putting down in front of his chair a pair of slippers of shiny leather and red heels. "Take your boots off, sir," suggested Spire under his breath. Cosmo let him do it. "Going to bed now, sir?" asked Spire in the same subdued tone. "No, but you needn't wait. I won't need you any more tonight." "Thank you, sir." Spire lingered, boots in hand. "The 2 small pistols are on the bedside table, sir. I have looked to the primings. This town is full of rabble from all parts just now, so I hear. The lock of your door is fairly poor. I shall be sleeping just outside in the corridor, sir. They are going to put me a pallet there." "You will be very cold," protested Cosmo. "I will be all right, sir. I've got the fur rug out of the carriage. I had everything taken out of the carriage. The yard isn't safe, sir. Nothing is properly safe in this house, so far as I can see." Cosmo nodded absent-mindedly. "Oh, wait a moment, Spire. That man, that fellow in the cap, is he still downstairs?" Spire thought rapidly that he wouldn't be a party to bringing any of those ragamuffins up to the bedroom. "Gone a long time ago, sir," he said stolidly. Cosmo had a vivid recollection of the man's pose of being settled for an earnest and absorbing conversation to last half the night. "He doesn't belong to this house?" he asked. "No, sir. He only came to talk to a young woman. I left him taking leave of her to come up to you, sir. I suppose he was the man you meant, sir?" "Yes," said Cosmo. "I have no doubt about it. He will probably turn up again." Spire admitted reluctantly that it was likely. He had been telling a long tale to that young woman. "She is very good-looking, sir." "Is she a servant here?" "Oh, no, sir. She came in with that old cutthroat cobbler. They seem to be friendly. I don't like the looks of the people in this house." "I wonder," said Cosmo, "whether you could manage to obtain for me a quiet talk with that man on the next occasion he comes here." Spire received this overture in profound silence. "Do you think you could?" insisted Cosmo. A dispassionate raising of the eyebrows preceded the apparently irrelevant remark. "The worst of this house, sir, is that it seems open to all sorts of rabble." "I see. Well, try to think of some way, Spire. You may go now." Spire, carrying the boots, walked as far as the door, where he turned for a moment. "The only way I can think of, sir," he said, "would be to make friends with that young woman." Before Cosmo could recover from the surprise at the positive statement, Spire had gone out and had shut the door. Cosmo slept heavily but fitfully, with moments of complete oblivion interrupted by sudden starts, when he would lie on his back with open eyes, wondering for a moment where he was, and then fall asleep again before he had time to make a movement. In the morning, the first thing he did was to scribble a note to the Countess de Monteveso to ask her permission to call that very morning.